All right, well, it looks like it's leveled off. We'll go ahead and get started. So welcome again to the September Dr. NAACLS about publications and disclosures. And we will also, after we get done with publication disclosures, we're going to tackle some frequently asked questions we saw on the listserv, but that will be close to the end. And also we'll have a chance for question and answers near the end of this session, so you can either enter your Q&A in the Q&A chat box, or we can take those over the microphone. You'll have to raise your hand, and I will give you permission to speak, and then you can unmute. So, well, let's see if there we go. So we always timestamp these because our compliance can change up to twice a year. For example, we just got done with our NAACLS board meeting about a week ago. So over the next month, you will probably see our documents update. So we always want to remind everybody that our compliance requirements can change at least twice a year. So if you're seeing this at a future date on the NAACLS News or our YouTube channel, and you want to confirm some of our compliance requirements remain the same, you can check our website for those documents, or you can always call the office, talk to staff. I have two guests joining me today. First is Charity Accurso, who is the RCAP chair. She will be helping me out with the standard 4 compliance issues based on her experience reviewing those as a site visitor, reviewer, and a committee member. And also NAACLS CEO Marissa James is on the call, and her and I will get into details about the survey at the end. So let's start with Standard 4. Standard 4 is one of our most cited standards, and that's probably because it has, as many of you know, a whole litany of requirements for what needs to be available to, I believe the standard defines it as current and prospective students. Kind of an easy way to think about that moving forward, and a very common way we'll be thinking about that and referring to that during this call, is these items need to be available to the public at large. Essentially, anybody is a prospective student if they're checking out your website, so they need to have a lot of these materials available. So the issues we're going to get into today is not a comprehensive list, but a lot of these strategies should be applicable to more than one item. And also, these are things that are very, we find standard cited very often, which is why we want to focus on them today. One step that we certainly recommend is that to really take time on your self-stating narrative to explain how your items are available to these certain constituents, how your website is organized, or your catalog is organized. So Charity, do you have any tips about what you've seen work in some of these narrative items about when they're describing, where they're describing some of these items are available to reviewers?
Sure. I think one thing that is really helpful, as Mark mentioned, is to be descriptive in the narrative. And if, as you're preparing the narrative, which is just explaining, here's where this information is, here's how we make it available to enrolled students, here's how we make it available to prospective students, is to print out the self-study review form that's available in the documents section on NAACLS. And as you're writing the narrative, you can have your Word document up and the checklist next to it. And so that's a good way to ensure you're touching on all of the points. And to be clear, this is how we do it for enrolled students. You know, for many, it may be a handbook. Your handbook may not be available publicly. Here's how we make it available for prospective students. So just the more blatantly clear it is, the easier it's going to be for the reviewer to say, yep, they have it, and check it off.
Yeah, I'm glad you highlighted that, because I may have oversimplified at the very beginning, because we often see program directors have challenges demonstrating that some of these materials are available to prospective students. So I automatically kind of corrected and mentioned the public, but as a reminder, a lot of these items all these items have to be available to current students as well. So for A1C, which requires programs to make their accreditation status, including name, address, and contact information to NAACLS available. This is a requirement in our standards, but it's not necessarily required to be available on every programmatic document. So Charity, do you have recommendations about where maybe program directors can focus on where to put this information?
Sure. I think, obviously if you have a web page, that's a great first place to put it. And it would be, on your main page where you're, describing the program. Depending on your institution, there might also be a page where your institution may list all the different accreditations that serve different programs. In terms of prospective students, if you have flyers or if there's a poster you might put up in, in a hospital lab or, something like that, it's helpful to have the address on there. One thing to think about is maybe printing this on labels, so that if you are putting a poster, I know sometimes it can be cost prohibitive to update, program handouts, or, if there's an error or something like that, that's an easy way to put a label on it, and so that information can easily be found. It doesn't have to be on every single document that you might share. And I think that's sometimes a confusing point. But as long as it's readily available, students, prospective students, and the public can know who accredits the program. It's really to your program's benefit as well to be able to share that you're accredited.
Okay, outcomes. So, as I'm sure everybody on this call knows, about 18 months ago, NAACLS changed its requirements, its compliance requirements for how where programs need to make its outcomes available. So their certification rates, their placement rates, and their graduation rates. We've received a lot of feedback, some questions about these outcomes versus the outcomes they put in their annual survey and self-study, and potentially aligning some of these numbers. We have certainly listened to this feedback, these questions. We have spoken to CHIA, our recognition agency. We've gotten feedback from them and some clarity, some much needed clarity from them about their requirements. And we are now have a task force made up of review committee members that is looking into the language, looking to try to make it as clear as possible for our program directors and our reviewers. So we don't have a lot of details about that yet. I think we just wanted to check in and let you all know that we have heard you, and we want to make sure you know that we are trying to develop something that's a little more user-friendly for all parties, but likely we won't have any results of that until after the April board meeting. Charity, did you have anything to add to that?
I do. I think one of the things for some of our programs that we have seen are that, we have our NAACLS annual survey, which has specific dates where you're going to, supply information. The site visit or the self-study document certainly has, certain dates that you're going to supply information and provide the outcomes. Depending on how your program is structured, though, that may not be the best format for you to share your outcomes. In terms of if your program is January to December, perhaps you're looking at and wanting to post your, that calendar year outcomes. And that's okay to do that on your web page. You need to have, at least, each of the 3 active years. My recommendation, though, is if you are using a different year, if you're using a calendar year versus the academic year, which is in the self-study document, to explain how you're determining that in your narrative. That just helps to, resolve any questions that might come up. Reviewers will compare what's posted on your website to what's made available in your self-study document. So if it makes sense for your program to show a different year format for some reason, go ahead and explain that.
Great, thank you. And then we kind of have some odds and ends here of some kind of frequent things we notice in standard 4A1, and we haven't stuck in standard 4C for some items we see on documents in training. But let's start with the advising and guiding students. Charity, do you want to go into a little more detail about the confidential and impartial part?
Sure. I think something that we see is just the need to have, a description in your handbook or some materials that says, students, may go to the program director who, will hold confidential conversations with the student, and, refer them as appropriate. But we need to know that that's the intention and you're stating that. And so including something like that in the handbook on how these issues are handled will address that concern. As well as, if there's an email document that you're making available in your materials, that one, you redact the student's name in the materials that you submit to be reviewed. But also, there aren't extra people being added to the conversation that shouldn't be. And so that helps to demonstrate the confidentiality place. Mark, do you want me to go through each one?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Okay. The second bullet is one that can sometimes be a little bit confusing. And it's something that can very simply be addressed is the clinical assignment when placement cannot be guaranteed. And this, there are a variety of situations where this can come up. One would be, there's a hurricane came through, flooded the school, and the school, closed, and what's your plan for that? But the other thing to consider is, for example, a program that has 10 students, they use a certain lab for their microbiology rotation. For some unforeseen reason, that micro lab cannot take 2 students. And so now you have 8 slots for 10 students. What is the process that the program uses to determine which 8 students go first? And there are a variety of ways to word that policy. It should, be made available in your handbook. I would go over it at orientation. I've seen programs base it on GPA of the students in terms of prioritizing others. What was the date which they completed their full application, and then how are those, say it's the 2 students who didn't get to do their rotation at first, how will they be worked into that next phase? So it's just explaining the process you're going to use. And that really, while we don't expect those issues to happen, they do. And so this clarifies for you all and the students what the process is going to be. And so it just needs to be explained. The third item relates to health and safety. And what I've seen more often as a review committee member when I look through the reports, programs do a great job of explaining how we train the students in health and safety, or the hospital lab, what they're doing. The piece that I think is more frequently missed is how are you documenting that the students were trained? And so it may be if it's an online training or a quiz or something they take after, including a screenshot of that grade book to show, students have completed it. If they're given a certificate, include an example of a completed certificate with the student's name redacted. If they sign off on having completed these trainings, include that completed sign-off sheet, not just the template, but to document that the site visit or the site visit reviewers can see that it was completed and students signed off and it's being used.
Perfect. So that's what we have for, we do have one more. I forgot about this slide. So this is kind of refers to what Charity kind of opened up with, when especially talking about the resources we have with the availability of our self-study review and site visit form. Those are readily available on the website. And I'm going to take a second real quick and just to walk everybody through the website so you can see where you can find that. Okay, so this is the NAACLS website. If you go to the program directors page, scroll down to where all of our resources are over here. Our major documents are right here. And then in documents, you can find these. This is a whole document repository. So not only our primary documents, which what were featured in that sidebar, but all of them. So I always search by title because I'm not patient enough to scroll. So if you type in review, all of a sudden you're going to see all of our review forms, including self-study review forms. So this is the exact same review form that your self-study reviewer is using. So you have complete access to it, determining on when your self-study is submitted. Those have different dates because our compliance document, as we mentioned before, our compliance requirements can change. So we update, staff updates those constantly. So there's one for the site visit report of this as well. So you can download the exact document that the reviewers have. Those should more or less be almost identical to the items identified in the standard compliance guide. But that standard compliance guide can get a little bulky. Therefore, if you make it want to do it something a little simpler, especially if you're bringing in a colleague that may not be that familiar with the NAACLS documents, you can just give them that document and it will show the checkboxes of if these materials are ready to go or not. So let me go back to this presentation. That looks like it is the last one for, well, now I have to go through all these again. So that will be the last one for standard 4. We can take standard 4 questions at the end of this, this section after we talk about survey. So Charity, thank you. If you want to hang out for a little bit, we're going to get into some of the frequently asked survey questions with Marissa that we saw on the listserv. So I believe this first section is something we kind of wanted to touch base on, Marissa, and this may have been a part of your CEO's CEO's corner, but the whole idea of adding additional questions to the survey was to help provide more data to the professional organizations we're partnering with. Did you want to talk about that partnership or that process at all?
Yeah, that'd be just fine with me. Thank you for letting me come today. So one of the things that NAACLS, as part of their strategic plan, is to help the laboratory profession, I guess, tackle the workforce shortage. And so one of the best ways that NAACLS can help with this is by ascertaining data from our programs. And so, and if you have the NAACLS news, if you subscribe to the NAACLS news, or if you go to our website and look at my CEO report, you can actually see the 2022 results of the data that we collected from all of our programs. And we broke it out into the different disciplines. But also, we are adding new questions. And these questions, what we are hoping is we will use them as kind of a roll-up among the various disciplines, and maybe help programs ascertain more resources. So that's why we're starting to ask about faculty student ratios, just to get a baseline, just to get an idea. And because other healthcare professions have more data than we do, or maybe they are better at disseminating that data, and they are using that to secure resources from government, for scholarships, for various things. And so the laboratory really needs to kind of up its game in that area. So that's the whole purpose of adding these new questions. I will say that the new questions are kind of a work in progress. And based on what we've seen on the listserv, we've received a lot of feedback. And so we're trying to improve them. And in doing that, we're a little bit delayed getting that survey out as well. So we apologize for anybody who has been ready since September 1st with their survey, their normal survey questions ready to go. You just have to kind of hang tight for a little bit longer, because we're trying to fit these questions into all of our different disciplines. So MLS, trying to ask questions that make sense to an MLS program, to a histo program, to a hospital-based program, to a university-based program, phlebotomy, all of it. So that's proven to be a bit of a challenge.
Okay, so as Marissa and I kind of mentioned before, this is very much in partnership with the professional organizations trying to address the labor shortage. But one thing we want to highlight is that all the new questions being asked, these work in progress questions that Marissa referenced, this is just to gather data. There is no punitive action that's going to be tied to the results of these answers. This is just a way for us to start to gather more information to kind of get a better idea of what's actually happening versus kind of what we think may be happening. Also, as Marissa mentioned, that due to the, one of the few, hopefully, drawbacks of non-prescriptive standards is we have so many programs out there being very creative and looking very different from each other. And as a result of that, it becomes tricky to really ask that perfect question where we can gather that perfect data. We've received a lot of questions on the professional phase. What does that mean? This is a term you'll see a little bit in other documents that NAACLS uses, but it's not something that's used a lot. So there's a highlighted portion right there that says, kind of defines professional phase as the portion of the program that is unique to the relevant laboratory discipline. Marissa, do you have any more details you would like to add to that?
Yes, so this does not include your general education courses unless you have like a 4-year integrated MLS program, which I know those exist. But you just have to do your best on answering these questions. For the most part, if you have a 2+2, maybe a university-based program, your 2 years that you're actually at the hospital or university setting is going to be that professional component. And then many times that last semester is where that practicum or that clinical portion takes place. But it is supposed to be when you're teaching the clinical hematology, if you're talking about MLS, or just where you're doing your actual laboratory profession preparations. And then in the example of a 3+1 program, that would be the 1 year. So oftentimes this is can be in a hospital-based program, is that 1 year for the MLS to use them as an example. So it's going to look a little bit different. And so you may have to do a little bit of fancy footwork to try and figure out what portion of your your clinical rotation is in a hospital versus a reference lab, which I think might be on one of the later slides.
Yeah, and I think for the self-study that they need to kind of do something similar to this anyway, because we ask when the last half of your program starts. And in that question, we never intended of you to incorporate the prereqs if it's not that integrated. So that can kind of be a frame of reference you can use this in a practice that you should already be doing. Full-time equivalent. Again, flexible programs, a lot of different models, especially with a lot of different students. There's a lot of discussion right now in accreditation education. What does a full-time student even mean? We understand that these phrases can be challenging, but again, we ask you to kind of hone in, hopefully on the spirit of the question, and try to figure out what is the most applicable. Something we already somewhat use within our own review process is in the self-study, we ask for faculty fact sheets for individuals that you consider your core faculty. That may be a good place to kind of start when you're trying to figure out full-time faculty. Marissa, did you have anything to add?
Not really. I like how you're kind of weaving in what we already use to help you help our program officials make sense of some of the questions and what we're actually meaning by it. We're not really trying to make life difficult for anyone. These are questions that are at the end of the survey. So they're going to be separated out. So you'll know that these are kind of these trial questions. Full-time equivalent is also a term that is used in employment. So as an example, in maybe a hospital environment, someone might work 36 hours a week, but they are still full-time, and we call them a full-time equivalent, even though they're not working 40 hours a week, as an example. So that's kind of where we got that from as well. And then we also realized that students may, they may take 12 or 16 hours, or, part-time is going to be anything less than 12 hours. We just, on those questions, we just want full-time, part-time, call it a day.
The clinical rotation, I believe this is a question we did change based on the feedback. So I think one of the questions I saw really broke into the separate clinical components of the clinical rotation to be redundant. And it seems like what NAACLS is looking for is just the full time of all of the clinical work together. Would that be accurate, Marissa?
Yeah. And so I think our MLS program directors get confused on this because you have a blood bank rotation and, with MLT2, you've got blood bank, you've got hematology, but really just try to think about it as just that clinical practical time. So whether that's in your clinical practical pathology assistant program or, it just that time frame. So, and if you do have different rotations that you're doing, 5 days here, 8 days there. What I did when I was just kind of sampling through some of the questions is I just added up 5 days to a week. I know some people do 4 days in a week, but just use your best estimate, add it all up, and it'll either be in weeks or months. And I kind of just convert 4 weeks as a month.
Okay. So there's a lot of different questions about the separate kind of labs that we're looking for. And ultimately, we decided that we don't expect programs to differentiate between student labs and simulated labs. Correct?
Yeah. Originally, we did have them separated out, and there's so much overlap. And based on what information we were trying to gather, it really did not make sense to separate them out. And so they are now slashed, which for anyone who's like, they're not the same thing. We know they're not the same thing. Just to try to keep things simple. That's, I think the different categories are hospital versus reference versus student/simulation. And so that hopefully that helps you. Hopefully that helps the question make sense for you to answer the best way you can.
So those are some highlights about some of the questions we saw on the listserv. We'll do some Q&A for both Standard 4 and this. We already have some questions in the Q&A section. You can raise your hand and we can do an audio one if you prefer. But before we do that, I want to point out DLPs. DLPs are volunteers on our review committees. These individuals are here to answer standard interpretation questions. They're not here to answer more process-oriented questions like a survey, for example. The survey questions should come mostly to staff, if not all the staff. But if you are prepping for a site visit, or if you have a question about your self-study, or you don't understand the standard interp, that's what these individuals are there for. And they are volunteers. So it's a good reminder for me to thank all of our volunteers. I saw some that are on the call today. It's a very busy time. We just got done with a board meeting. We have self-study reviews going out. We're scheduling site visits. Our review committees will begin to work within a month. So if staff is busy, that means our volunteers are busy too. So thank you to those volunteers that are currently on this call or maybe watching later. So let me get to my fun GIF and then we'll start the Q&A. So the first question is about outcomes. Do we need to have the outcomes listed in the handbook, or will it be okay to just have it on the web page? So if you have a web page is not required to be a NAACLS accredited program, but if you have a web page, your outcomes must be posted either on your program's landing page or within one click of an easily identifiable click from that web page. That is a requirement from our recognition agency, CHIA. If you do not have a web page, you need to make sure you have those policies clearly stated when we ask you in the annual survey, as well as documentation about how you are fulfilling those policies. So I remember sitting in a park meeting and we had a program, what hospital-based program that didn't, and this is just an example, this is not an NAACLS requirement, but we had a hospital-based program that didn't have a website, and every time somebody called, they got their email and they followed up with their outcomes, and they had the email documentation to show they were doing that. That's an example of if you don't have a website, the kind of, again, narrative and documentation we're looking to make sure that you are in compliance. So this question is about the survey. What about Path A programs? Almost all of our content is unique to our program. Is it all professional phase? You want to take that, Marissa?
Yeah. That sounds like it would be all of your professional phase, because they're path A all the way. So yeah, so then just do your best to kind of carve out if you have I think I remember your email was mentioning not really hospital lab, but reference lab. We also added we do have a lot of like open-ended or comment boxes. And if you feel like you need to add a explanation, or if you need to add in a clinical lab that we didn't think of, please do, because we're going to be taking all of these suggestions to try and help us for next year, for next year's questions. So yeah, do the best you can. If you need to clarify in a comment or add a line somewhere, please do. It'll help us.
I am the faculty member in charge of clinical and the capstone project 2. Full-time equivalent then would be the professor taking care of the clinical rotation.
Yes. And so what you're going to find out is on one of the other questions, they're going to ask you to carve out, or we are going to ask you to carve out what are they doing? So, are they just in charge of the program, or do they have other obligations? As an example, some of the the preceptors in a clinical lab are also a laboratory supervisor, or they are also in charge of, maybe your program director's in charge of 2 programs. So that's what we've tried to do, because there's so many different ways to teach in a program. And I see something about adjunct as well. And so what we're trying to do is figure out like essentially how many people does it take to run a program based on the number of students. So like some programs might have 8 adjunct, but only 10% of their workload is related to their histology program. So that's kind of what we're trying to figure out. If they're full-time, call them, 1 full person. But you may be able to also say 4 adjuncts at 25% each, which then would be, one person essentially. That's what we're trying to do. And it's a challenge for sure to try and figure that out. But that's basically the end goal, is how many people does it take to run a program? How many people do you need? And my understanding is it can take a lot of people, but then another program somewhere else tries to argue, but they must only be teaching 1 class. Well, maybe not. How do we know? Let's find out.
Okay. And then I think that kind of answered the last 2 questions. Okay.
Yes.
Just so those listening who don't have access to the questions, we had a question that Marissa already answered right now that said, I'm hospital based. If I have many folks that lecture, can I just add the lecture time to determine full-time equivalent?
Yes. Yeah, you can do that if you would like, if it's easier for you to put 1 person, or if it's easier for you to put 4 at 25%, however you want to do it. You can add a little comment in there if you want to. Yeah, just do the best you can. And there is also a spot at the end of this survey for you to give us feedback on, like, is there something we forgot? Is there a better way to ask a question? I'm even open to, it would be interesting if we could find out how much XXXXX, and a potentially new question that we can try and figure out how to ask next year.
Those are the questions we have right now. I'll leave it for a few minutes, but as I leave it, don't feel anxiety that you have to ask all your questions here. Obviously, staff is here to assist you. Our person in charge of the survey is lingering in the background, so she's also listening to all the questions we're getting. But also, we're all really busy, so I will not keep everybody on the call if we don't have anything else. So, last call. Okay, that's it. So Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for a lot of really good questions, and especially those questions on the survey that kind of can help us refine this and improve it. Our next Dr. NAACLS is not scheduled yet, but it is about all of the decisions made at the last board meeting. So I'm hoping within the next 10 days, our new board president, Robert Cottrell, and I will get together with our schedule and we will set a date for those. Ramona, where is the survey? I'm a new PD. So the survey is not out yet. We sent out preview questions to the survey. That's where a lot of the people saw the questions and sparked a lot of the discussion on the ASCLS listserv, but the survey is not out yet. Those will be emailed directly to you. Those do not come from a third-party source. Those are emailed directly from NAACLS, which is why it's always very important to make sure that your program director information is updated to staff. So we make sure you get those emails that you need to. Okay, that looks like it's about it. Have a great afternoon, everybody, and we'll talk again next month.